the king who disguised himself as a peasant by night to night, as the modern world dims its insistent glow. We step quietly into the flickering lamplight of a forgotten age, drawn by the subtle music of a past that still whispers. We walk the silent, cobbled streets of a medieval city, a place where kings moved not just on gilded thrones, but sometimes in shadows, and where lanterns swayed in alleys, thick with the ancient scent of hay and the comforting warmth of hearthfire. Our tale, much like the winding streets themselves, is drawn from the half-lit pages of old chronicles, bound in leather that cracks with history, where the austere truth of royal decree and the vibrant breath of fable often blur into one compelling narrative. These are stories told in the smoky corners of taverns, where ale-fueled voices debated the fates of empires, or meticulously preserved in marginal notes of dusty, forgotten manuscripts, tucked away in the deepest recesses of monastic libraries. Our story begins not with a name etched in gold, but with a man whose true identity time tried, with all its relentless might, to erase. Yet his deeds, like sparks struck from flint, stirred both awe and a curious, unsettling fear in equal measure across the lands he governed. In some distant, sun-drenched realms, where caravans brought exotic spices and silks, he was revered and spoken of as a just monarch, a shepherd to his people. But in others, perhaps in the very city we now wander, whispers painted him as a meddling ghost, an unsettling specter that intruded upon the tightly woven affairs of commoners, disrupting the established order. What set him apart was not the weight of an iron scepter, heavy with symbols of unyielding power, but rather the quiet diligence of listening ears on. More tellingly, the leather shoes worn thin and smooth from countless nightly walks. Some scholars, poring over ancient texts, claimed with conviction that he was none other than Harun al-Rashid of Baghdad, the legendary caliph who would slip unnoticed into the labyrinthine alleyways of his sprawling city in the simple, unassuming robes of a merchant or a pauper. Others, particularly in the chillier climes of the north, swore it was a Henry of England, cloaked in rough wool and deep shadow, his face obscured by the very darkness he embraced, seeking out truths hidden from his gilded court. But tonight, let us not bind him to one singular historical name, for in doing so, we might diminish the universal truth of his actions. Instead, let him be simply the king, for it is the profound and transformative role he played on simultaneously unplayed that we remember, a duality that defined his extraordinary reign. The king was no stranger to the immense, crushing weight of a crown, both literally and figuratively. His court, a shimmering testament to wealth and power, was as grand and elaborate as any in Europe or the opulent caliphate. A vast hall with soaring, carved cedar beams that smelled faintly of distant forests, stained glass windows through which the morning light fractured into dazzling, kaleidoscopic patterns, like fragments of captured dawn itself. Courtiers, bedecked in silks that whispered with every calculated movement, often found their opulent garments rustling louder than their hushed, diplomatic tongues. Justice, in this magnificent setting, was pronounced with great ceremony, beneath canopies of embroidered stars, often accompanied by the solemn boom of gongs and the intricate rituals of ancient law. And yet, beneath this dazzling veneer, a deep, pervasive weariness settled in the king's soul. He mistrusted the polished, honeyed words of his advisors, finding them too smooth, too perfect, too devoid of the grit and reality of his kingdom. He grew to despise the rehearsed tales brought before his throne, narratives crafted to present an idyllic, manageable version of his realm, one that bore little resemblance to the disquiet he sensed in the very air he breathed. A growing unease gnawed at him. He felt disconnected, a sovereign adrift on a sea of flattery and filtered information. The reports from his tax collectors painted a picture of prosperity, yet he saw the gaunt faces of his people on feast days. His generals spoke of victories and secure borders, but he heard the faint, distant echoes of hardship and discontent carried on the winds. He longed, with an aching, desperate hunger, to see with his own eyes, not through the lens of a courtier's report, nor the embellished verse of a royal poet, but with the unvarnished clarity of direct experience. The genesis of a secret life, the genesis of his secret life, began subtly, a seed planted during a particularly tedious audience. A guild master, whose words were as smooth as the polished marble floor of the throne room, presented a petition assuring the king of the flourishing state of the city's weaving industry. He spoke of bountiful harvests of flax and wool, of looms clattering ceaselessly, of a citizenry content and prosperous. But later that day, as the king took a rare, solitary walk along a less frequented battlement, he overheard a laundress in the courtyards below. Her voice, thin with fatigue, complained to a stable hand about the astronomical price of even the coarsest thread, and how her children shivered through the nights, despite her endless efforts. The stark contrast between the gilded lies and the raw truth struck him like a physical blow. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that the walls of his palace, so grand and protective, were also blindfolds, sealing him off from the very heart of his kingdom. He spent weeks in quiet contemplation, the laundress's words echoing louder than the pronouncements of his court. The burden of ignorant rule became unbearable. He knew he could not simply command truth to appear, for truth, he suspected, was a timid creature, easily intimidated by the flash of a royal guard's halberd or the stern gaze of a minister. It hid in shadows, in whispered complaints, in the calloused hands of laborers. And so, a radical, dangerous secret began to take root in his mind. He confided only in Elias, his personal valet, a man whose loyalty had been forged in the crucible of shared dangers and quiet trust since their boyhoods. Elias was of common birth, wise in the ways of the street, and possessed of an uncanny discretion. When the king first outlined his plan, Elias's eyes widened, a flicker of fear mixed with an understanding glint. "Your Majesty," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rustle of the king's silken robes. "The risks are immense. Discovery would be catastrophic, and the risk of remaining blind." "Elias," the king countered, his voice low but firm. "Is that not a catastrophe of a different, perhaps graver, sort?" Elias, seeing the unwavering resolve in his sovereign's eyes, bowed his head in assent. From that night forward, a silent, intricate conspiracy of truth began. Under a veil of absolute secrecy, known only to Elias, the king would rise. He would wait until the cathedral bells had tolled past midnight, their deep echoes fading into the hushed quiet of the sleeping city. Then, with practiced ease, he would cast off the heavy, embroidered royal finery that symbolized his daytime persona, shedding the suffocating weight of silk and ermine. The crown, a circlet of gold and jewels that often pressed painfully against his temples even in daylight, was exchanged for a rough wool hood. In their place, he would dan the plain, rough garments of a common mason, or a stable hand-simple tunics of homespun wool, breeches patched and worn, boots scuffed and practical, meticulously chosen by Elias from the market stalls. Sometimes he would carry a carpenter's satchel, its leather worn smooth by years of honest toil, filled not with gold, but with the tools of a craftsman, or perhaps a small, gnawed loaf of stale bread and a dented tin cup. Other nights, he would lean heavily on a crooked walking stick, adopting the shuffling, deliberate gait of an old beggar, his body language speaking of hardship rather than power. Elias would subtly smudge his face with charcoal or dirt, dulling the regal sharpness of his features. An unkempt stubble would replace the carefully trimmed royal beard. His face, unshaven for days and half-shadowed by the hood of his cloak, bore no resemblance whatsoever to the majestic, idealized figure etched into the kingdom's coins or painted with reverent detail on chapel walls. And then he would walk. He walked into his city knot, the gleaming, ordered city of court scribes and grand pronouncements, with its clean, wide avenues for royal processions. But the living, breathing city. This was the city where bakers rose long before the moon had fully sunken below the horizon, their ovens already glowing like embers, filling the cool night air with the comforting scent of yeast and baking bread. It was where the breath of donkeys steamed in the bitter pre-dawn frost, pulling carts laden with produce for the early market. It was where the low murmur of gossip, intimate and revealing, curled like wood smoke around the half-open doorways of humble homes, and the distant, mournful cries of alley cats echoed in the narrow passages. Here, in this authentic realm, he listened. He listened not as a ruler, his presence commanding deference and carefully chosen words, but as a stranger, an invisible observer, simply another shadow in the night, free to absorb the unfiltered symphony of his people's lives. Encounters in the labyrinth of truth, his early forays were tentative, marked by a nervousness he had not felt since his first battle as a young prince. He feared recognition, but even more, he feared missing the truth. He learned to meld into the background, a talent he honed with each passing night. He discovered that the darkness, while concealing his identity, also amplified the raw honesty of the city. Without the blinding glare of daylight and the watchful eyes of authority, people spoke more freely, their hopes and despair laid bare. One autumn night, beneath the swollen harvest moon, a moon that seemed to hang heavy and ripe over the city spires, the king paused beside a smithy. The air here was thick with the scent of hot iron and damp earth, punctuated by the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil. Sparks, bright as trapped fireflies, leaped from the forge, briefly illuminating the grime-streaked face of the blacksmith. The man, whose wrists were roped with muscle and soot, cursed softly, the words rumbling deep in his chest. "Another shipment, another price hike," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. "This iron, it's turning to gold for them, but for us, it's turning our coin to dust." His apprentice, a boy scarcely 12, with wide, earnest eyes, murmured a folk prayer to the ancient forge god Wayland, his fingers tracing a symbol older than the cathedral walls on the cold stone of the hearth. It was a gesture of desperation, a plea to a power more elemental than any king. The king, his voice raspy from disuse and feigned age, asked softly, "Have the guilds spoken of a solution to this scarcity, Master Smith?" He knew, from court reports, that the Ironmongers' Guild had assured the royal council of abundant supply and stable prices. The smith grunted, a sound of profound cynicism. He paused, his hammer hovering, then dropped it to the ground with a resounding thud. "Guilds speak only to coin, old man," he spat, his gaze fixed on the glowing metal. "They speak to the fat purses of the merchants who hoard the ore, not to the empty bellies of those who turn it to steel. The rest of us bend or break." He picked up his hammer again, the clang echoing the finality of his words. The king moved on, the smith's bitter truth a cold weight in his stomach. He made a mental note to scrutinize the next guildmaster's petition with a newfound skepticism. In the quarter of the dyers, where narrow lanes smelled perpetually of damp wool and exotic chemicals, enormous vats steamed with vivid violet and deep indigo, their fumes stinging the king's eyes. Here, colors seemed to bleed into the very stone of the buildings. He encountered a woman, her hands forever stained an indelible blue, like ancient tattoos. She worked tirelessly, her movements fluid and practiced, yet she laughed often, a clear, bell-like sound that seemed to defy her weary posture. As she sang an old song of sailors lost to sea, their ships swallowed by the hungry waves. "Only the dead return," she said, when the king, feigning curiosity, asked of her husband. A man whose name she revealed was Thomas. "But the rent comes every full moon, like a tide that never recedes, and the children, they eat whether the sea gives up its dead or not." He learned her name was Alara, and her quiet resignation, devoid of self-pity, spoke volumes about the daily grind of survival. The king felt a pang of shame for the banquets in his palace, where food was discarded carelessly. He thought of the tax ledgers, neat rows of figures that never hinted at the human cost of sustenance. Not all tales were sorrowful, however. Beneath the shadow of the Eastern Aqueduct, a magnificent feat of Roman engineering that still brought fresh water to the city, he stumbled upon a clandestine game of dice. The players were a motley trio, a burly tanner, smelling faintly of cured hides, a surprisingly jovial monk whose robes were patched in many places, and a one-eyed midwife, her remaining eye sharp and discerning, who wagered with dried rose hips, each holding an almost spiritual significance to her. They argued, drank from a communal flask of potent, raw spirits, and recited verses from a traveling poet who had once claimed to be born under a comet, a wandering minstrel whose irreverent verses about pompous lords and resourceful peasants were far more popular in the common quarters than any court-sanctioned epic. The king, careful with his few silver coins, lost on purpose, enjoying the camaraderie and the genuine, unforced laughter that filled the damp night air. He learned that the tanner, despite his gruff exterior, secretly penned love sonnets, and the midwife, named Maeve, had a talent for predicting weather patterns that put the court astrologers to shame. He left them with a strange sense of belonging, a feeling he rarely experienced within the gilded cage of his palace. The unveiling of his city in time, the king came to know the intricate corners of his city far better than his most seasoned ministers did. He learned which baker, Master Iman, secretly watered down his dough, making the loaves heavier but less nourishing, a desperate measure to stretch his meager profits. He tasted the difference himself, a subtle lack of richness, a bread that crumbled too easily. He learned which priest, Father Gregory, held a mistress in a quiet cottage on the city's outskirts, a secret known by half the parish, but carefully concealed from the bishop. He knew which orphan, a young girl, named Lyra, with a voice like a nightingale, sang better than the court's most celebrated minstrels, her melodies carrying the raw emotion of street life. He saw the overt cruelty of petty tax collectors, like the notorious Grimaldi, whose thick fingers seemed to linger over every coin, extracting more than was due, and the quiet, almost invisible kindness of whores, who, despite their own desperate circumstances, gave blankets to the freezing children huddled in doorways on particularly cold nights. He witnessed the desperation of young men forced into banditry by impossible debts, and the stoic resilience of old women who spun flax until their fingers bled just to buy a handful of grain. He catalogued these observations not as a judge, but as a student. Each rustle of straw in a stable, each shouted curse from a tavern brawl, each infant's cry echoing from a tenement window, added another brushstroke to the vivid, unvarnished portrait of his kingdom. He learned the rhythms of the city at night, the changing of the watch, the early rising of the market gardeners, the last drunken songs fading into silence. He knew the shortcuts through hidden courtyards, the secret passages within the old city walls that only smugglers and vagabonds understood. He learned the subtle language of the city's underbelly, the coded whistles of thieves, the knowing nods of night workers, the silent despair in the eyes of the hungry. And each morning, as the sky in the east began to lighten to a bruised purple, and before the cathedral bell summoned the faithful to prime, he returned unseen to his chambers. Elias would be waiting, a silent shadow, to help him shed his disguise and don the ceremonial robes of a king once more. There, still wearing the dust of the streets and the lingering scent of wood smoke and damp earth, he would sit at his grand oak desk. Before him would lie the neatly bound court petitions, the reports from his treasury, the edicts drafted by his council. But now he would read them with new eyes that had seen beyond the parchment and into the very souls of his subjects. A crown tempered by truth, his reign over the following years became known for its unpredictable, yet often profound, justice. His counselors, long accustomed to predictable pronouncements based on their carefully curated information, often found themselves bewildered. Sometimes he ruled harshly, his decrees cutting through layers of corruption and privilege with surgical precision. He knew intimately which fines were unjust, imposed merely to fill the coffers of a greedy magistrate or to punish the powerless. He understood which titles were undeserved, granted not for merit but for sycophancy. He could dismantle a fraudulent land claim with a few pointed questions that revealed specific details only a true witness could know, leaving the claimant sputtering in disbelief. He once disbanded an entire tax collection office after hearing, through hushed whispers in a bustling market square, about their systemic extortion of small traders. His pronouncements, once measured and formal, now carried an undertone of raw, undeniable authority that stemmed from direct, first-hand knowledge. At other times, he showed clemency that startled his council, baffling them with his seemingly inexplicable mercy. "This man," he would declare, gesturing towards a trembling peasant accused of stealing a loaf of bread, "has already paid more dearly than our prisons could demand." He knew, from his own observations, the biting hunger that had driven the man to desperation, and the rapacious greed of the baker, whose profits far exceeded his needs. He might order the man to serve a short term of community labor, perhaps repairing a bridge or cleaning the city's wells, rather than imprisonment. and ensure that the baker was quietly subjected to stricter scrutiny regarding his weights and measures. His decisions were no longer theoretical judgments based on legal precedent, but empathetic responses rooted in human understanding. He often found himself overriding the advice of his most learned scholars and experienced generals, preferring the wisdom gleaned from the streets to the logic of the court. His intuition, sharpened by countless hours of listening, became his most potent tool of governance. Years passed, the city changed. New spires, financed by a revitalized economy and fairer taxes, rose majestically into the sky. New laws, etched in Latin and Arabic alike, brought a greater sense of equity to the common folk. Yet the king's night walks remained a secret, known only to Elias and, in time, to the silent, knowing stones of the city itself. Only once was he nearly caught, a moment that sent a genuine tremor of fear through him. On a particularly frost-bitten night, when the moon was a sliver and the cold seemed to bite at the very bone, a watchman stopped him beneath a broken lantern. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows that made identification difficult. But the guard, a burly, grizzled veteran named Boren, was diligent. "State your name, old man," Boren demanded, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. As he lifted his torch closer, its flames struggling against the wind, the king, his heart thudding a rapid rhythm against his ribs, forced a smile through his beard, a smile that conveyed a blend of humility and knowing mischief. "Only a poor seller of kindling, sir," he wheezed, adopting the slight stoop of old age. "And it seems my trade has deserted me on such a bitter night. Shall I fetch you some to warm your lonely vigil?" He offered a small, gnarled stick of firewood from his satchel. Boren grumbled, assessing the man before him. There was something in the pauper's eyes, a glint of intelligence and quiet amusement that belied his humble attire. "Move along then, old man," he waved him on, dismissing him with a gruff gesture, "and keep your kindling to yourself. The night is cold enough without old men pestering the watch." The king continued his slow walk, a wave of relief washing over him. He chuckled silently to himself, the absurdity of the moment momentarily lightening the weight of his secret. Years later, when that same Boren, through diligent service and an unblemished record, rose to become captain of the city watch, he often recalled the glint in the pauper's eye, a memory that would resurface in quiet moments. He knew too much to be nobody, Boren would sometimes muse to his most trusted lieutenants, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity for all his rags. But Boren, despite his intuition, never connected the dots, never betrayed the strange encounter to anyone who mattered. He simply stored the memory as one of the many unexplained oddities of the night watch. Long after the king died, his official reign ending with a grand funeral and solemn ceremonies, strange rumors began to drift among the city folk, like seeds carried on the wind. Some claimed the ghost of a benevolent peasant walked the streets at midnight, blessing children in their sleep and whispering ancient secrets to stray dogs. Others swore the king had faked his death, choosing to live out his days among them forever, preferring the freedom of the streets to the confines of the palace. A simple, rough-hewn stone was placed, almost accidentally, at the edge of the bustling marketplace, marked by any royal crest or inscription. Yet it was always garlanded with fresh rosemary, a symbol of remembrance, and humble scraps of bread, a sign of sustenance and gratitude. No one knew who had placed it there or why, But the tradition persisted, and still today, in that forgotten city whose name scholars debate and whose location maps omit from their precise grids, it is said that rulers must walk barefoot through the streets at least one sunder cover of night. Stripped of their finery and their titles before their crown is truly theirs, before they can truly understand the ground upon which they stand. Thus ends the tale of the king who wore two faces, one of gold, gleaming and majestic, and one of dust, humble and true. But of the two, it is the dusty one we remember best, for it was the face that saw the people. Waves of influence that spread far beyond the palace walls and the span of a single reign. Stories whispered from apprentice to apprentice in dusty workshops. A small, intricately carved token, perhaps a bird or a leaf, found mysteriously under a cobbler's bench one morning. A folded note, pinned to a monastery door in ink made of soot and wine, bearing a cryptic message. These were fragments, scattered seeds of a profound idea, bound in plain goatskin, devoid of the usual gilded illuminations. It contained only a single entry in the very center of its otherwise blank pages. He who listens unseen sees most clearly. Thomas, initially baffled, showed it to his abbot, a wise but traditional man. Scholars have since debated the purpose of this peculiar manuscript, some calling it a crude forgery, others a divine revelation, still others a secret testament to a forgotten wisdom. But among the people of the city, passed down through oral tradition, the belief remained. This belief manifested in subtle yet powerful ways. In the winter of the year of the broken cometa celestial event that brought both wonder and a strange foreboding to the land, devastating fire swept through the Baker-S quarter, consuming homes and livelihoods in a ravenous blaze. Dozens were displaced, freezing and hungry, and the palace treasury. The people gathered, furious and desperate, their anger a palpable current in the bitter air. Among them, a man named Cale rose, gaunt and determined, his voice ringing with conviction as he claimed to bear the last true words of the king. Whether Cale had once met the king in disguise, or simply believed he had, none could say with certainty. But the crowd listened, their murmurs quieting to a rapt silence, for his words resonated with a truth they felt in their very bones. It was a silent rebellion, a testament to the king's real legacy, self-reliance and communal strength born from understanding. Later still, in the twilight of the old dynasty, as its power waned and its grip on the people loosened, a young girl daughter to a washerwoman in the oldest, poorest districts sang lullabies no one remembered teaching her, in a language no one recalled learning. Her voice, sweet and clear, carried melodies that spoke of ancient truths. "He walks," she sang, rocking her younger brother in her arms. Her lullabies, unusual and haunting, spread through the community. When questioned by curious neighbors, she could only say, "I heard it in the market, under the rosemary," pointing vaguely towards the unmarked stone. Her songs became a quiet anthem, a reminder that true power resided not in visible might, but in unseen wisdom. His face always shadowed, his words wise. In the glassworks near the bustling harbor, where the air shimmered with heat and the smell of sand, an artisan, known only as Lyra, etched intricate scenes onto fine, translucent panes of glass. A cloaked figure walking through crowds, only his eyes visible above a scarf, watching, learning. These images were prized among the common folk, hung in humble homes, a silent acknowledgement of the watchful monarch. These were not just stories of nostalgia for a bygone era, born not from open revolt, but from the ingrained belief that the powerful should serve the powerless, and that listening was the first step to true leadership. Every generation found its own version of the wandering king. Some imagined him as a barefoot scribe, meticulously recording the lives of the poor. Others as a woman cloaked in midnight, her keen eyes seeing through deception. Some swore they saw him in the mirror just before dawn, a fleeting glimpse of a compassionate gaze. He became the conscience of the city, a benevolent presence inspiring acts of kindness and quiet resistance. In this way, the king who disguised himself as a peasant did not vanish with death or dust. He multiplied, dispersed, and lived on not in palaces of gold, but in the humble resolve of those who still believe that power must listen before it speaks, that compassion trumps decree, and that the greatest throne is built upon the trust of the common folk. Thus ends the longer telling of a story not bound by one man, one city, or one crown. A tale woven into the very fabric of a forgotten kingdom, remembered not in grand histories, but still, enduringly, in dust and dream.